I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Pastor Tim for letting me do this. It's a great opportunity for me to get a little bit of experience leading a Bible study, and I hope it will be a blessing to you all as well. This evening, we're going to be covering quite a bit of ground. We've got 4 Sunday nights to work through Titus. And Titus is 3 chapters and fairly long, so if we had more time, we'd break it down some. But since we don't, we're going to cover the whole first chapter this evening, and then we'll go from there. The first thing that I would like to do is give you a little bit of background information on the book of Titus. It's helpful when we go to study a book of the Bible if we understand a little bit of the historical background, even a little bit of how it has been perceived through time by people who study Scripture. So, the pastoral epistles, which you'll hear me reference a lot, are the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're called the pastoral epistles because the material they contain is all very practical and directed towards the church. And when Paul was writing to Timothy and Titus, he was writing to 2 pastors. So that's why we call them the pastoral epistles. And these epistles have been viewed by the church as authoritative for a long, long time. Back in the early days, after the time of the Bible and Revelation was written, around the year 90, there was a series of councils to basically decide what books of the Bible were going to go into the Bible that you now hold in front of you. And the church fathers, the ones that came along right after the canon was closed and John wrote Revelation, from a very early date, recognized Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy. So for a very, very long time, from the very earliest days of the church, these books have been viewed as authoritative. Now, another thing to keep in mind when you're studying Scripture, and sometimes when you study Scripture, you might go look at outside sources, at commentaries, or different items that have been written by scholars to aid you in your study. An important thing to note is that in the 19th century, there arose a form of biblical criticism called literary criticism. And these people did not hold the same high view of Scripture that the church fathers did, that many evangelical commentators hold, and that your Southern Baptist pastors do. They held a view of Scripture that was essentially heretical. They came to Scripture with their own preconceived notions, their own biases about Scripture, and applied them over the text. They said that because Titus sounds different than Galatians, Paul must not have written it. Well, that just doesn't make any sense. If you look at Galatians and you look at Titus, you can tell that they're written to completely different groups of people. They're written with a completely different focus. And so what these people are doing is they're bringing their own biases about Scripture into the text and laying them over the text. And then when they read it, they're reading it through those glasses. And so I say that to help you as we go through this Bible study. I want us, as we go through this Bible study, to leave our biases out in our cars and hopefully run over them as we go out the parking lot, because we don't need those anyway. Leave those biases behind and approach the text just looking at the text. And that's what I want us to do this evening and over the next 3 Sunday nights. We're just going to try and look at the text, read what's there, and interpret it in a manner that is God-pleasing, God-honoring, and true to Scripture. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the background situation. This is something that can be useful to you as we're going all through this Bible study in Titus, and something that you can use in your own personal studies when you approach Scripture. It's wonderful to have some background information on the books of the Bible that you're reading through. You'll understand more about what Paul is saying. If you know the historical context to which Paul was writing in Titus, it'll make so much more sense. If you know the historical context behind Romans, behind Mark, behind Revelation, those books will make so much more sense to you. So, the first thing we're going to do is talk about the situation in history to which Paul was addressing. Paul went on a number of missionary journeys, and during these missionary journeys, he would establish churches in communities and towns all across the countryside, all across the Roman Empire. And during one of his missionary journeys, he traveled along the Aegean Sea and established a number of churches. These churches had come under increasingly desperate attack from counter-missionaries, people who would come in behind Paul and attempt to turn the young church, who had just accepted Christ and was just beginning to grow, attempt to turn the young church toward a religion that was an odd amalgamation of Jewish beliefs and Gnostic heresy. Now, these followers of Gnosticism, which you need to understand a little bit about before we get into the text of Titus, because there's a lot of things in Titus that address this Jewish Gnostic heresy. Gnosticism and followers of it came from a number of different religions. They weren't just Jewish, they followed all sorts of other pagan religions, but they had kind of one central ideology, one central idea, and that is that the physical world, the physical realm is bad. And that is in stark contrast to what Scripture teaches. The Gnostics would come and teach that the physical realm, you want to leave it all behind. You shouldn't get married, you shouldn't have a family. You need to focus on this otherworldly, spiritual, mystic, voodoo nonsense. And Paul and the Gospels and the entire text of Scripture teach us that our physical lives matter. What we do in this life matters. We're here to glorify God with our physical existence. And the Gnostics would say, no, that doesn't matter. What you need to focus on is this otherworldly spiritualism. And so that was what Paul was dealing with the Gnostics. Now they also had some Jewish elements in there. And so these Gnostic Jewish heretics would come in behind Paul and they would say, well, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, because why would somebody who died and gone on to the spiritual realm want to rise back in a physical body? That makes no sense. So that's obviously heresy. And then they would come along and they would say, oh, and you also need to keep the food laws. You need to keep kosher. And so this was causing all sorts of problems in the church. And you will see Paul writing letters dealing with these heresies, and you'll see it crop up in Acts, and there's just all sorts of problems with these Jewish Gnostic heresies. So that's a little bit of background about the people who were just causing so much trouble for Paul, so much trouble for the congregations that Titus was trying to lead. And so now let's look at why Paul wrote the letter the way he did. If you look at Galatians or Romans or Corinthians, you'll notice that those churches, or those letters, are written to a group of churches. They're not just written to an individual, like Titus or Timothy. Paul wrote these letters to individuals, addressed them to individuals, because the churches had grown to such an extent that writing a more general letter to the group of churches, like the ones in Corinth, would not have been as fruitful. So he wrote this letter to Titus, not with the intent that Titus would keep the letter to himself and stick it in a keepsake box somewhere in his house. He wrote the letter to Titus with the intent that Titus would go out into the churches on the island of Crete, where Titus was located, go out into the churches, read this letter out loud to the churches, and then be there to answer their questions and help them apply what Paul had written. Essentially, he was sending Titus and Timothy as extensions of his apostolic authority into the church, because he couldn't be there himself. All right. Most scholars agree that Titus was written somewhere between 60 and 65 AD. This was towards the end of Paul's ministry. 2 Timothy was the very last letter that Paul wrote, right before he was executed. And so these pastoral epistles are the last writings that we have from Paul. And so you can kind of see that coming in some places. These churches that Titus was dealing with were not necessarily super small churches. Sometimes we think of the New Testament churches as being a dozen people, maybe less, meeting in a little small house. But there were actually some very wealthy people in the early Christian church with very large houses, and sometimes these congregations could be as many as 100 to 200 people. And so the church in some places was very large, in some places it was very small, And so Paul would send this letter to Titus, and he could go out into these individual churches and read the letter and share these teachings with them. All right. Background information. Keep that in your head as we go through the text this evening and as we go on in these next 3 Sunday nights. That will come in useful, and sometimes we'll refer back to that information. So keep that in the front of your mind.